Gentlemen, this is 3:30 p.m. Already it's 25th April. Time passes like an arrow, and the time passes like an flowing water. How are you doing today? I'm going to comment on South Korea's one of the hottest issue nowadays going on in the political circle for special Korean citizens living abroad who cannot understand Korean fluently, but who could understand English very well. I'm sometimes commenting on some major issues of Korean politics in English because some of my acquaintances abroad ask me to comment in English so that they could understand on the Korean sensitive political issues or diplomatic security issues with more understanding without language barriers. So I'm responding to their request sometimes. Today I want to comment on prosecution reform compromise made by Democratic Party, ruling Democratic Party, and also, as of now, opposition, People's Power Party. But already in less than 2 days, undemocratic compromise backfired by the name of political collusion. President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol voices concern of prosecution reform. He hopes that the ruling and opposition parties will pool their wisdom to address the public concern of controversial legislation on prosecuting reform, his spokesperson said Monday. As we all understand that the ruling Democratic Party and the main opposition People Power Party agreed last week to curtail the prosecution's investigative right to 2 crime types. One is corruption, the other is economic crimes, before removing it completely. And this agreement represented a breakthrough compromise between the rival parties that had sparred fiercely for weeks over DP's headlong push for legislation that would deprive the prosecution of all investigative powers immediately. The deal, however, drew unexpectedly strong criticism from the public that lawmakers colluded to shield themselves from prosecution's investigations, as the agreement calls for excluding crimes related to elections, public officials from prosecution probe. So understanding this kind of context, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol called for the entire political circle to reflect deeply on the right answer when it comes to the defending the values of the Constitution, and when it comes to protecting the people's lives and to pool their wisdom. The question is, ruling Democratic Party is not listening to people's voices. They are only concerned with their own argument that the original prosecution reform bills must be passed through the General Assembly of the National Assembly. We know that President-elect Yoon's stance has been closely watched, as the President-elect is a former prosecutor general who quit his post last year in protest of the current administration's push to strip the prosecution of its investigative powers in the name of reform. And since Yoon was elected last month, Democratic Party has pushed to use its majority in the National Assembly to pass the necessary amendment to Prosecutor's Office Act and the Criminal Procedure Act and to get them signed into law before President-elect Yoon could get a chance to veto them after taking office on May 10th. And on this conflict-ridden political tension between ruling and opposition camps, the National Assembly Speaker Park Byung-seok brokered a compromise, a deal. But after deal was compromised, the compromise deal backfired in less than 2 days. The widespread public opinion is that politicians colluded ahead of the June 1st local elections because they don't want to face investigations. And People's Power Party floor leader Kwon Song-dong said after a party leadership meeting Monday, asking the Democratic Party to accept a review with an open mind. Already it backfired. Also, ruling Democratic Party floor leader Park Hong-gun slammed the People's Power Party for reversing its stance and vowed to press ahead with passing the bills through the National Assembly on Thursday or Friday. So again, conflict-ridden political circle of the Korean National Assembly. Also, the prosecution cannot agree on the compromise bill and clearly opposes it because the bill is something that only delays the implementation of the bill, scrapping the prosecution's investigative powers. Kim Ho-sung, the prosecutor general, said in a press conference. They say it is unconstitutional, and people say it is unconstitutional. I think all the lawmakers, both ruling and opposition parties, know that it is unconstitutional. So it is not named by the word prosecution reform. It is prosecution undemocratic development, something like that. It is right. Of course, we understand in politics sometimes compromise is better than confrontation. But this does not mean that striking a deal solves all the problems at hand at once. And after all, compromise is likely to entail a host of unresolved issues, grievances from those who prefer confrontation. But as of now, as President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol voiced concern, and as many citizens voice his concerns, tackling such post-deal problems appears very much tricky, to say the least. It is true that the rival parties buried the hatchet temporarily and announced a compromise deal on prosecution reform on Friday. But today is Monday. In less than 2 or 3 days, it backfired. We all understand the core part of the deal, at the heart of the compromise deal, drawn up by Speaker Park Byung-seok is allowing the prosecution to temporarily keep its investigative power while cutting down the total types of crimes the prosecution can investigate from the current 6 only to 2 categories. The 2 types crime the prosecution would be allowed to investigate are only corruption and economic crimes. Very limited investigation. But it only signals a temporary delay. It's not a substantial change to the reform view. And as the deal stipulate, once a special judiciary reform committee sets up a new investigative crime agency and other related agencies. Strengthen their capabilities. The prosecution's unique and overwhelming investigative powers will be completely stripped, including the remaining 2 crime areas. So we are much more worried, by this kind of controversies. And if the bill passes without any further talks or public hearings and compromises in the future, if the bill passes within April, it would be promulgated within the last State Council meeting, probably presided over by the current President Moon Jae-in on May 3rd, something like that. But this must not happen. Otherwise, a lot of demonstrations and a lot of disorder relevant to this kind of political undemocratic moves will be widespreading, not only in political circles but also the citizens' arenas. So, understandably, the compromise bill faces a series of angry attacks. For instance, as I told you, Prosecutor General Kim Woo-soo, he was offered to resign in protest over the postponement of the ruling party's plan on Friday. Also, other high-ranking officials, including Deputy Prosecutor General Park Sung-jin and the heads of all 6 regional high prosecutors' offices, also tendered their resignations. Also, some lawmakers, with patriotism, from the opposition party, civic organizations, and legal experts, expressed concerns about the forthcoming reform bill, which could overhaul the prosecution's function. In general, it could be summarized into a critics of the bill argue that the police would have to take over investigations in the other 4 major types of crime by around 4 months after the passage of the bill, naturally, which will be leading to problems. Since the police are already overburdened with too many tasks and duties, this situation would lead to citizens' complaint and extended delays in handling snowballing cases. So, building up enough capabilities to handle serious crimes will take a longer time, much longer time than document says. So, the police are ill-prepared to take over highly sensitive political cases, such as 청와대's allegedly meddling in Ulsan mayor election, the controversial assessment of a nuclear power plant, and the doubt of the so-called blacklist of state agency. So, in total, given the opposition from prosecutors and the deepening public concerns about negative side effect, both ruling and opposition parties should discuss and implement steps to make up for the vacuum of investigating authorities. Especially President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol is making voices, concerning this kind of undemocratic movement, hurting constitutional values. So this kind of undemocratic compromise, which is backfired by the name of political collusion, should be stopped. So they are only undermining justice system. ruling and opposition parties are under fire by the people for compromising the justice system for political purposes. The Democratic Party appears to have won what it wanted. It can prevent the prosecution from digging the dirt on the outgoing President Moon Jae-in administration by eventually stripping the law enforcement agency of investigative powers. So, making the prosecution into a toothless tiger with only the authority to indict, people's basic right in such a democratic country cannot be guaranteed. How could such a huge, well-trained prosecution authorities only deal with corruption and economic crimes? Temporarily, until a new investigative unit, possibly resembling the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation, is set up in 1 year or 6 months. When? People are watching, history is watching this kind of undemocratic compromise. So, again, let me convey general people's sentiments, anger over this issue. The ruling Democratic Party and People's Power Party, opposition, People's Power Party, should not collaborate in preventing the prosecution from investigating politicians over corruption, power abuse, election law violations, and other grave crimes. They need to take more time to have sufficient discussions and build a social consensus on the matter. Reckless and hurried legislation push will only disrupt the criminal justice system and rule of law, which is one of the key elements of sound democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, Korean citizens living abroad, I'm sure that you are surprised by this kind of undemocratic moves going on in the South Korean political system here. I am also dumbfounded by this kind of undemocratic moves as a political scientist who has been struggling against this kind of undemocratic development in the past 30 years. Sometimes history recedes. Sometimes history advances. But definitely this prosecution reform bill is a clear signal of history backfiring, receding, backstepping. So, National Assembly, which represents the South Korean 52 million democratic citizens, should not pass this kind of undemocratic, unreformative bill, ultimately to hurt the basic right of South Korean citizens. Without social justice, without legal justice deeply rooted in our society values, ultimately the ordinary people's right to secure happiness according to the amount of effort they make, according to the amount of sacrifice they make for our country, South Korea. This kind of effort will be fruitless if social justice and legal justice is not guaranteed. 300 lawmakers of Korean National Assembly should be fully aware of this kind of undemocratic moves will ultimately hurt the South Korean ordinary people's livelihood, and it will hurt advanced democratic values of South Korean citizenship in the future, which will be such a big burden to our descendants, when they interpret the current history of South Korea happening here, 2022 in April, by the name of political collusion, reformative bills, prosecution reformative bills. They will evaluate, they will assess this kind of undemocratic moves surely as such a corrupt, collusive, and undesirable collusions of dirty politics. And they could classify this kind of politics as not third class politics, rather fifth class politics. So what a shame on the current politicians, undemocratic moves happening in South Korean political circle nowadays. Let me strongly argue that again, prosecution reform must be fully based on people's wishes, people's understandings, to guarantee constitutional values and ultimate right of general South Korean ordinary citizens. This is the right answer. I hope politicians should review one more time to fully accommodate this kind of an historical request and ordinary South Korean citizens' request not to hurt the constitutional values of South Korean politics. Okay? I'm saying this again. Thank you. This is Backfired TV Alert. Thank you. I'll come back to you next time.